Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Carlfeld, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Professor Gerald Pollack. Professor Gerald Pollack is founding editor-in-chief of the scientific journal Water and is recognized as an international leader in science and engineering. The University of Washington faculty chose Pollack in 2008 to receive their highest annual distinction, the Faculty Lecturer Award. He was a 2012 recipient of the coveted Prigogine Medal for Thermodynamics of Dissipative Systems. He has received an honorary doctorate from the Ural State University in Ekaterinburg, Russia, and was more recently named an honorary professor of the Russian Academy of Science and foreign member of the Sparsky Academy. Pollack is founding fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering and a fellow of both the American Heart Association and the Biomedical Engineering Society. He recently received an NIH Director's Transformative R01 Award for his work on water and maintains an active laboratory in Seattle. Pollack's interests have ranged broadly from biological motion and cell biology to the interaction of biological surfaces with aqueous solutions. His 1990 book, Muscles and Molecules, Uncovering the Principles of Biological Motion, won an Excellence Award from the Society for Technical Communication. His subsequent book, Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, won the Society's Distinguished Award. In his newest book, The Fourth Phase of Water, Professor Pollack takes us on a fantastic voyage through water, showing us a hidden universe teeming with physical activity and lays a simple foundation for understanding how changes of water structure underlie most energetic transitions of form and motion on Earth. Dr. Pollack, or Professor, do I say Professor or Doctor? What would you prefer?
Oh, as you like. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. So Professor Pollack, it's truly an honor to have you on the show here today, and it's such a fascinating subject.
It is fascinating, and thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled and delighted to be with you.
Thank you so much. And what piqued your interest focusing on water? Obviously, there are so many different directions a scientist can go. Why water?
Well, water was actually not in an original direction. In fact, I remember to this day, as a graduate student and about to get my degree, and there was a Japanese professor who was in our department, and he came to me in a sort of fatherly way, and he said, you could do anything you want in your career, but don't study water. And, this came to me as a shock, because why would anybody not want to study a particular subject? And the reason was that there were a few debacles. There was one at the time, and another one took place later, which were embarrassing for the people who were doing the studies. And in fact, they actually, to a large extent, lost their careers because of some audacious material that they published, which later, in both cases, turned out to be confirmed by many people. But at the time, they were almost scandalous in their revolutionary character. And so he knew about it, and he wanted to protect me from that, so stay away from water. So years later, when I was busily studying the molecular mechanism of contraction in muscles, and there was a real problem with the existing theory. To this date, there's a problem with the theory. There's a widely recognized theory of muscle contraction put forth by a famous Nobel laureate who passed recently, Sir Andrew Huxley, who was a distinguished scientist, received every honor, every accolade you can imagine, from a Nobel Prize to president of the Royal Society, et cetera, master of Cambridge University, one of the colleges at Cambridge University, et cetera, and it was his theory, and his theory simply was wrong, or still is wrong, if you don't mind my being so blunt. It's accepted by almost everybody, but if you look at the evidence objectively and compare the predictions of that theory with the evidence, it just doesn't fit. And I spent many years of my career trying to figure out what does work instead of what doesn't work, and it came to me through an Israeli colleague who had been working in my lab, who knew something about water, that almost nobody came to the realization that the muscle was not just proteins, actin and myosin and such, but mostly water. So our muscles are 2/3 by volume, approximately 2/3 water, maybe even more in young people, and nobody had taken into account the role of water. It's just assumed, and still assumed by most scientists, to be the background carrier of the more important molecules of life, which would be proteins, nucleic acids, and such. And I thought something's got to be wrong with this, because how could it be that, if you actually do a molecular count, this 2/3 of volume, if you line up all the molecules inside the muscle cell or any cell, and you start counting them one by one, more than 99% of those molecules are water molecules, because if it's 2/3 by volume, water, in order to fill up that 2/3, since water is a tiny molecule, you have to put a lot of those molecules in to make up that 2/3 fraction. So the people who've done the arithmetic come to the conclusion that it's something like 99.5% of all the molecules in the muscle or in your body are water molecules. And how arrogant it is to think that a cell, like a muscle cell, where 99.5% of the molecules don't do anything. So that struck me, and I had the good fortune at that time to meet a scientist who's now approaching 100 years old, Gilbert Ling, and Gilbert for many years had professed that the water inside the cell was not like water in a glass, not like any other water, that the water molecules are lined up as they would be in a crystal. And he made quite an impression on me. I met him at a conference and read a couple of his books. I gave one to my students, and every one of them said, yeah, this guy is on to something really, really important. Maybe he doesn't exactly have it right 100%, but it's so important what he's doing. And so I got interested, and I plunged in. And so after plunging in, first thing I wanted to do was to make widely available the information from Gilbert Ling about the ordered water. And it wasn't actually just Gilbert Ling. There were other scientists along the way who had professed or suggested that the water inside the cell was different. And one of the other ones is Albert St. Georgi, the guy who won a Nobel Prize for discovering vitamin C. And besides that, many people consider him to be the father of modern biochemistry, a Hungarian guy. And he also had a similar idea that the water was critically important, and there was such a thing as ordered or structured water, and that you really had to take this into account in order to understand how the body functions. And so this was a launch point, and I mostly wanted in the second book, Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life, I mostly wanted to make the ideas of Gilbert Ling available to the general public. His writing, tends to be somewhat dense. If you're a physical chemist with years of experience and know how to read between the lines, you won't have too much trouble. But if you're like the rest of us, it's a challenge to get through. And so I wanted to take his ideas in a kind of simplified form and make them available to the world.
Yes.
I don't think I succeed. Well, I don't. Pardon, I didn't hear what you.
No. Yes. Yeah. No. And that's the thing is that it's such an important topic, the water, and to really understand the structure behind it and how water is different, like you're mentioning, that in a glass is different how it is in the cell, and people just don't recognize it. We're just going to take a quick little break for commercials, and we'll be right back. You're here at HealthMade Radio. I'm here with Professor Gerald Pollack. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm here with world-renowned Gerald Pollack, and we're discussing water. So, Professor Pollack, you were there. You're in a. I believe I was reading in the book that Professor Huxley was in your house, in your living room, and you needed to confront him about that he was wrong. So how is he wrong? How was he wrong, and how is he wrong?
Well, because in order to explain that, I need to explain his theory,
Yes.
and I don't want to take a lot of time to do it because that will distract from the many things to say about water, but let me encapsulate. So the basic theory is that the way a muscle contracts is that you have two different protein filaments, like long rods, that basically slide past one another. And you can imagine if they slide, that the distance from the end of one to the other end of the other could change. It could shorten, and that's the general thought. Is like having two pencils that you slide past one another, and the way they're supposed to do that is that these little ore-like molecules go from one filament, the so-called myosin or thick filament. They extend out like oars, and they kind of row past the thin filaments or the action filament. And as they row, they kind of latch on, swing, and then detach, and they go through cycles of that. And that's what drives one filament, the actin filament, past the myosin filament. And it's a nice theory, and there has a lot of virtues. But if you look even at the most primitive or the most fundamental suggestion, or not suggestion, but attribute of this theory, is that, like the pencils that slide past one another, they don't change lengths. You see, and if you read the textbook, they just slide, that's all. No length changes in those proteins. But if you read literature starting back from 1950 on to the last I tabulated all the results contradict it. It's not just a minor contradiction, but if you look at the textbook, they'll tell you that the filaments remain at constant length. If you look at the original evidence, it will tell you that the filaments change length. And they change length sometimes by not 1 or 2%, but 30%, 40%, huge changes. And these changes have been ignored. And most people who read the textbooks don't care to look at the original evidence. But if you do look at the original evidence, you'll find that overwhelmingly, with a few exceptions, but not many, overwhelmingly over a period of 50 years, anybody who's ever studied or addressed this question has come up with evidence that is just not in agreement with a theory based on constant length filaments.
And I assume that this is kind of a common within the scientific community, that the fear of challenging the status quo, even though evidence points strongly in the opposite direction. Totally,
and for that reason, we've actually put together a foundation. Again, we're digressing a little bit. It's called the Institute for Venture Science. Knowing what you just stated, that it's really difficult for someone to challenge the establishment, so to speak. Let me just before I take a time to 1 minute or so to talk about the Institute for Venture Science. I should say, the reason for this difficulty, nobody likes to be challenged, right? Or at least most of us, especially people who have developed careers and have become renowned in their careers, and it's like round Earth versus flat Earth. So suppose all the world is convinced that the Earth is flat, right? You just look out the window and you can see that it's flat. And someone comes around and says, I think you guys are wrong. I want to get a grant to study the possibility that the Earth is round, and here's my preliminary evidence. I've seen satellite photos. You could kind of see the curvature of the Earth. I've seen pictures from the moon. It looks like a sphere. It doesn't really look flat. And by the way, I took off from Seattle, and I flew west, and I made it to Japan, and I then made it to the Middle East, and then to Europe, and then to Washington, D.C., and back to Seattle from where I originate. And, I was looking out the window looking for the edge of the flat Earth, and I couldn't find it. So I've got this preliminary evidence and that the Earth is round, not flat the way you think, and please give me a little money so I can study it. So what happens? It goes to the gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper says of the agency from whom you're soliciting funding, and the gatekeeper says, this looks pretty radical. I better get the experts in the field to judge this. Is this guy for real, or is he a lunatic? Everybody knows the Earth is flat, so let's get the best people to review this. And who are the best people? Well, the flat Earth people who have made their careers. They've risen to the top. Do you really think they want to be challenged by someone who says that all you've done in your entire career is wrong? Yeah. That's the last thing they want. And so we think of scientists like other people as being totally objective and looking for truth, but scientists are also people, and we have egos and such, and we don't like to be challenged. And so what we like to do is to make sure that the challengers don't succeed. And if you have the power, which the flat Earth people in my example have, because they're the big guns in the field, they can easily deny you funding by saying, there's this problem with your grant application or that problem, and you lose. And so scientists know that if they come forth with any kind of radical idea that challenges the usual paradigms, that they will lose. And therefore, any scientist who's canny enough to have succeeded to a PhD knows the idea is, if you have a radical idea, keep it to yourself, because it won't succeed. And so as a result, science has come to a point where you don't see many scientific revolutions. You see lots of technological revolutions, right, like iPhones and such. Whoever would have dreamed of that? Yeah. But fundamental scientific revolutions, like, for example, the sequence of DNA or the splitting of the atom or something akin to that, it's really hard to identify revolutions that have taken place in the past 30 or 40 years or so. You can count them on your fingers. So this is a big problem, because if we want to solve the world's problems, both medical and climate and all the problems that are besieging us and challenging our longevity, this is a real issue, because we need those fundamental breakthroughs, those revolutions, in order to build the technologies to solve the problems. Right now, technologies are based on old science from 100 years ago. We need new science to create technologies that we could never ever have conceived. And so as a result of that, the first one is, yes, you hit the nail on its head. This is a very serious problem afflicting science, especially in the current political climate, and we've done something about it. We've created the Institute for Venture Science, and it's a new institute. It's getting going right now. We've made a lot of progress, and what we do is fund only promising ideas that challenge the current thinking that's outlived its usefulness. And we've gone through a vetting process, and we've picked out 5 proposals that, if anybody is seriously interested in donating to, we're privately funded. We're happy to share that information.
Yeah.
Or if anybody wants to look on the website, it's actually a pretty cool website. It's IV Science, the Institute for Venture Science, ivscience.org. And there you'll see it. So we're not just sitting back and letting things ride the way they are. We're trying to do something about it, trying to do something constructive. And I'm sorry, I've deviated far from.
That's okay. Science, and I agree with you. It seemed like there was such an explosion in science late 1800, early 1900, and then
absolutely,
it seemed like everything, we're just rearranging furniture as it is right now. So I mean, to be able to fund these young, bright minds, that are willing to question the status quo, I think that's an amazing venture that you're doing. We're going to take another quick break for commercial, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I am here with world-renowned Professor Gerald Pollack. So one of the things that you discuss in your last book called The Fourth Phase of Water, you're challenging the paradigm of water, where water is just not an inert substance where things that transports important things like protein, but it's actually the thing that creates a charge, that helps with energy production, that it does a huge amount of things. Can you tell me a little bit about easy water or exclusion zone water? What is that?
Okay, so we all grow up learning that water has three phases: a solid, liquid, and vapor. Ice, liquid water, and the humidity. And for many years, some scientists have said, it can't be right. You must have a fourth phase, because with those three phases, there are so many features, physical, chemical features of water that are not explainable. And that theme has continued on for literally more than 100 years, including Gilbert Ling, who I mentioned, and Albert St. Georgi and such. And so there was a kind of expectation of another phase, and the phase, it turns out to be what Gilbert Ling was talking about, where the molecules of water are not random and bouncing around, but ordered. And we started doing experiments to find out more about Gilbert Ling's ideas, basically, because we'd done nothing in this field, but only in the field of muscle contraction. So it was new for us, but very quickly we found evidence for the idea of ordered water. And before I forget, because I want to make sure I mention it, this is actually the water that fills our cells, that fills our body, this fourth phase. So what is this fourth phase, or exclusion zone, or easy? So when we started to do the experiments, we started with a gel. And the inside of the cell is kind of gel-like. And we put the gel in some water, and the water had little particles. We used microspheres. And when we looked in the microscope, we can see that those microspheres were excluded from a zone just outside the gel. If the gel is a cube, then outside every face of the cube, there would be a clear zone. We called it exclusion zone, or easy for short, easy to remember, where those particles or spheres were excluded. It was actually pretty big. It could be as much as half a millimeter. You could see it with your naked eye. You didn't even have to, use a microscope, although we used microscopes. And that's where it all started. And when we saw that, I knew that if we had water that was structured like a crystal, that it would have exactly that characteristic. It would exclude particles. It's kind of like if you think about ice. As the ice forms, you get a pure crystal, and the pure crystal, in order to gain its purity, it pushes out all the other stuff that's there. So if there's salt around it, for example, it pushes out the salt. And so if you have an iceberg, the iceberg is a pure crystal. It doesn't have any salt or other kinds of contaminants or particles or whatever. So I was thinking there must be, if there is that ordered water, we ought to be able to see evidence of it. So we saw that, and once we saw it, I was almost certain this is what we're looking for, but we did many, many experiments to show that the properties of this exclusion zone were completely different from the properties of ordinary water. The structure is different. It actually is not simple water molecules lined up, but they're lined up in a kind of particular way. It's sheet-like, hexagonal sheets that pile up upon one another, all built from the water. And the water, as soon as the water hits the right kind of surface, we're talking about hydrophilic surface, a water-loving surface, the water undergoes this massive transformation to this ordered kind of water, and it builds layer by layer, and it could build to more than, actually beyond 1 million molecular layers if you do the arithmetic and you know the size of each layer. So this is what we call the fourth phase of water, because it's got physical chemical properties that differ markedly from ordinary water. And so that's one feature, and you've got it next to we have some evidence, not complete, next to pretty much every biological surface, because inside the cell and outside the cell too, the biological surfaces are charged and they're hydrophilic.
This easy or exclusion zone water, I mean, that it's pretty much like you mentioned, it exists within every cell. I mean, this is a water that our cells are filled with, and it creates this exclusion zone, or the separation. It creates an electrical charge, meaning there's separation then of positive and negative within the water in itself.
Correct. So the way this builds is that it starts with a regular water molecule, which is H plus OH minus, or H2O. And what happens is that the water molecule splits into H plus and OH minuses. And the OH minuses gather to form these sheets that I've been talking about. And the H pluses go out into whatever ordinary regular water there is and forms so-called hydronium ions. So yes, you have charge separation because the fourth phase water is negatively charged, and the water beyond that, the ordinary water, gets positively charged. So it's like a battery, and in fact, you can get energy from that battery. Oh, and all of this is described in a lot more detail in that fourth phase book, which, by the way, has become pretty popular. I'm kind of surprised if you check on Amazon. My mother would have been proud.
Well, it should be popular, and there's a way. So this separation, it happens naturally just because you have a hydrophilic membrane, like the cell wall membrane, or you have the different organelles within the cell. So it creates that separation naturally. But is there something then that can kind of build that and make it stronger or make it weaker?
Yes.
Creating a higher charge or lesser charge. Obviously, a higher charge would support more energy production within the cell, correct?
Totally. Yeah, this is a really important point that you bring up. You need, in order to create the charge of batteries, what we have is basically a battery consisting of ordered molecules. To order molecules requires energy, and to charge your battery requires energy. So to do what I've told you requires energy, and the question is, well, where does that energy come from? And the answer, we found, that is light. This was a big surprise, but we found that, and we have a lot of evidence for that now. And so light comes in, and particularly infrared light. We found that we explored light with wavelengths ranging from the ultraviolet to the visible to the infrared, and we found that infrared is by far the most powerful, maybe almost 1,000 times more powerful than, say, blue light, especially at a wavelength of 3.0 micrometers. So you put on any light, but particularly in the infrared, which is, by the way, infrared is all around us. I'm sitting in my office right now, and if I were to turn off the lights and close the shades and such and completely black and pull out my infrared camera, I see a beautiful image of everything around me, the bulletin board, the telephone, the little radio that I've got, and et cetera, because the infrared is all around us. We often think of infrared, what's that? When we think about the inside of the electric oven or the toaster, the coils glow bright orange and it's hot, and we think, oh, it's emitting infrared light, but everything emits. And so if everything emits, that means the energy that's required for building this kind of water is available all around. We also generate it ourselves because, the metabolic energy that generates heat, basically, it's essentially the same as infrared energy. So your core is generating infrared, and that also lends fuel for the buildup of this kind of water. So, yeah, you need energy in to get energy out. It's just like your cell phone battery. I have no cell phone, by the way, but I'm told that in order to use your cell phone, you need to plug it in to recharge the battery. Otherwise,
it runs out.
It runs out.
Does this challenge? So this exclusion zone water that fills in our cells, does that challenge then the current thinking on how energy is actually? Let's take a quick break because I know it's not going to be a short answer because it's an important question.
Okay.
We'll just take a quick break for commercial. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're listening to Health Made Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Professor Gerald Pollack. So this exclusion zone water that fills the cell, and also the separation then of charges that generates this battery effect that is then also supported or recharged by light around it, especially infrared. And obviously we get a lot of infrared from the sun, but also just from objects all around us. And also, like you mentioned, the metabolic activity of the cell in itself generates this heat, this infrared. So does the exclusion zone water, does that challenge the mitochondrial activity that we're used to? I mean, how we think about how energy is produced within the cell?
Well, yes and no. First of all, we're taught about ATP, and that ATP is basically the ultimate form of energy that's delivered. I think of muscle contraction, where the splitting of ATP with each stroke of those oars that I mentioned is thought to be the underlying energy source. But there's a challenge to that. Most people are not aware of the challenge, and the challenge was first brought to my mind by Gilbert Ling, and you still can find it on his website, gilbertling.org. I don't know how much he's maintaining it, but he talks about the time that ATP was discovered, and someone said it's got a high energy bond, and that bond could deliver energy for use by the cell. And a year later, someone wrote a paper challenging that, saying that no, the people who wrote the paper made a mistake, a numerical mistake, and it's not true. And nobody has cited that paper, or that nobody that I know of, because it became very popular, the idea that ATP it carries the energy of the cell. And Gilbert Ling discusses this, and he thinks that the phosphate from ATP actually acts in a different way, and I think he might be right, acts as with a high negative charge as a nucleation site for the buildup of structured, as he says, or we'd say easy water. So I think it's worthwhile for anybody who is seriously interested in the energetics of the cell to check what Gilbert has said, go back to the original papers, and make a decision yourself as to whether you think the prevailing idea is correct or not correct. So another possibility is that the cell gets some or maybe even most of its energy through electrical means. So we've got all this negatively charged water, easy water in our cell. And by the way, slight digression, I won't take up more than 30 seconds. I think it's possible that this negative charge of the easy water is actually responsible for the negative electrical potential that all cells have. The world of science, biological science, thinks about channels and pumps, And I think that's not correct. I wrote a paper about it a couple of years ago, but I don't want to take the time to go into that. But so the cells are negatively charged, and at least part of that, I'm confident, comes from the negative charge in EZ water. And this is potential energy. As I mentioned, it's like a battery. So you have negative charge from the EZ water and positive charge elsewhere, and that's a battery. And batteries contain energy, and I think that this energy is, at least in part, the energy that we use. Plants do it, right? They take in light and they convert the light energy to chemical potential, which drives the metabolism, growth, bending, whatever. And so I would argue that there's a good possibility that humans actually work in a not too different way. As I said, the first step in building this EZ water is the breakage of an ordinary water molecule into negative and positive components. That's exactly the first step of photosynthesis. Same. So what we're talking about is possibly a kind of generic first step of photosynthesis where light energy is used to give the plant or an animal, in this case, energy. It's not so radical. If you think about Mother Nature, who decides to create animals after being so successful with green plants, if you were Mother Nature, would you discard this energy transduction mechanism, or would you kind of retain it along with other ways that we now can get our energy through eating?
Yeah, would make sense to me that if you have a system that works, why create something different?
Exactly. Yeah, I think so too. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that we get energy from eating. We experience that all the time. But I think we also get our energy from light, and I think that's the reason why we hear so much about the breatharians who don't eat for long periods of time, and many of them claim that they can do it, that they're highly spiritual in their approach. And it may be that the people who are highly spiritual have a larger capacity than maybe others to absorb this kind of light energy and transduce it into something that they can use. I haven't heard of a good alternative to explain why these people can get along without eating, and except for the response that they're all lying. And I know enough people who do that to know that, at least for some, it's certainly not true.
And so, you mentioned, I know, that they actually did scientific experiment to prove that what they said was actually correct. I mean, obviously, they hadn't been able to prove their whole life existence, but for long enough time to prove that what they're doing actually worked, just breathing, getting energy from breathing and existing that way.
Yes, absolutely. It's a fellow who has become a kind of friend from India. There was that famous story of the guy who claimed that he hadn't eaten anything for 65 years, and actually didn't drink anything either, which is a real surprise, but it's humid there, and some plants can actually get their water from the air. It's not totally surprising. But he claims he hadn't eaten, and so he reported himself to the government, and after a lot of shuttling around, he finally got to a physician who studied him, and they put him in a hospital room for, I think, 10 days or something, and they had video cameras, and they had an array of approximately 15 doctors, from a urologist to a cardiologist to a pulmonologist. Every ologist you can think of was there. And that group certified, they made physiological measurements over 10 days. They certified that he absolutely did not eat or drink anything. And at the end of the study, the guy was telling me that he wanted to take him from the hospital room to his office to sit and chat for a while. And his office was a few floors above. And this guy, after 10 days of not eating or drinking, ran up the stairs faster than he could run. So it's a kind of amusing story. But they all certified that he absolutely got on just fine. They measured his bladder, which actually increased and decreased in size periodically. and other physiological measurements. And then there was this group of doctors was then certified by leaders of the city, like the mayor and people saying that they're legit, that they're not lying or something. So I think that's about as good evidence as you could find for this. There's also a book. What's the guy's name? I think it's called Life from Light. And it's about a guy who's a PhD scientist who decided that he was not well and he was too fat, and he's going to do this. And he followed a regimen, and he's been doing it now for quite a few years. And he thinks that the energy comes from light. He has no evidence for it, but he thinks. And this is a guy who's a scientifically well trained and is the director of a scientific group. I think Germany, Switzerland, or somewhere, or at the border. And so the evidence, I think, seems pretty compelling that this is not someone's trick. That people can actually do it, and if they can do it, they've got to get their energy somewhere, because we can't live without energy. And I think it's likely that the energy comes from light, and the light builds the easy water. And the easy water is critical for everything that happens inside your cell. It doesn't just sit there. It plays a central role in the action of all the proteins that undergo folding to do what they're designed to do, whether it's for muscle contraction or for secretion or cell division, or nerve function or whatever. So you need the water, because the ordinary state of the protein is with the easy water around it. And if you don't have it, if you're dehydrated, you can't function, because the protein sees an environment that's strange. Where's my easy water that I'm so accustomed to? So the easy and the protein are actually, they kind of merge to form a single unit. And you can't dismiss the water. The water is part of the action. It's a central part of the action. And I think that's a reason why, if you add more light or more electrons to build the EZ, that's another way of doing it, you get better health. And I'm sure of the various ways to feel better, like earthing yourself. You're basically pulling electrons from a negatively charged earth. And these electrons, we found in the laboratory, you add electrons and you transition ordinary water to EZ water, which is negatively charged.
Yeah,
and also.
I would just take a little quick break. I'd like to kind of go and see what we can do as a lay person to increase that battery charge within the cell, and to increase the easy water, and if there are things that takes away easy water, and detoxification, what role does easy water play in that? So we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. You here with Professor Gerald Pollack. So, Professor Pollack, how can we, as a normal individual, maximize the amount of easy water within our cells? Since that seems to be what is driving the energy within the cell, and obviously the more energy we have, the faster a cell can repair, the longer we live, and the less tissue breaks down, and the less likelihood it will go into dysfunctional tissue, like probably cancerous tissue. But so how can we, as an individual, then maximize the amount of easy water within us?
Okay, so there are two features that are characteristic of the buildup of easy, that drive the buildup of easy water. One is light, especially infrared, and the other is electrons, because we've shown in the lab that you add electrons to water and you get easy water. So what you want to do is that. So the first on the list, I got a list of half dozen or so, is drink a lot of water, because you don't want to be dehydrated. So the water that you drink, some of it goes out, but some of it gets transitioned into EZ water, and the EZ water is what hydrates your cells, and you need to hydrate your cells in order for them to function. So, if you played two tennis matches and you've had it, you sit down at the bench and and drink a lot of water, and you feel, in 5 or 10 minutes you're almost okay again. That hydration is extremely important.
And is there a certain kind of water that is more important than another? I mean, some people like distilled water, other like spring water, other people just drink from the faucet or reverse osmosis. I mean, is there a certain type of water that's easily accessible that would be the best?
I wish I could answer that question. So many people ask me, and I can give you, you might say, a theoretical concept on what I think would be the best water to drink, but I'm not sure because this has to be tested experimentally or clinically to see what's the same way that you do drug trials. You could do water trials, but of course, the National Institutes of Health, I think that the word water is not in their dictionary. It's. No. I would think that if they invested $5-10 million, which is what a good study would take to study different kinds of waters, including the ones you've mentioned, there are many. This would be one of the best things they could do for human health, because I know that some of the waters can reverse pathologies. I've seen the evidence, but I can't tell you which one. So I think from a theoretical point of view, any water that contains EZ in it, that has some EZ water as part of it, a fraction of it, if you drink that, it's likely to be the best for your health, because the body needs EZ water, and if you drink EZ water, then you don't have to convert it from ordinary water to EZ. It's already converted.
My question is that easy water is kind of the transition from liquid phase to frozen phase, from water to
solid,
ice.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
and frozen. Yeah.
And so that is kind of a very similar structure as the frozen, the hexagonal structure.
Exactly.
But then at the same time, you're mentioning that the infrared, which is heat, is then what increases this exclusion zone. So should you have water that is exposed to sunlight and that increases EZ in it, or should you freeze it? And then kind of right before it freezes, it has the most amount of EZ water.
Well, right before it freezes, it should have a lot of EZ water. Our experiments in the lab have demonstrated that. There are also many features that we don't understand. So it may or may not be possible to take exactly what we've seen in the laboratory and apply it out there. It might be, but it needs to be checked. The other approach is to take ice melt. Just after as the ice is melting, we published a paper on this. It transitions into EZ water, and then the EZ water transitions into ordinary water. This is also described in great detail in the book. And so I know there are some cultures where they like to use ice melt, and the ice melt, presumably, based on what we know in the lab, is full of EZ water. So that should be good for health, and I think some cultures know that it's good for health. So that's part of it. And I wish that people would experiment using infrared light and seeing what happens to volumes of water. It's not too hard to check to see if you've got EZ water. If you have a spectrometer, and every chemistry department at a university has one, and a lot of companies too, and it tells you how much light is absorbed. And we know that there's a kind of signature absorption. When you have EZ water, the light absorbs at a wavelength it's in the ultraviolet of 270 nanometers. And so that's how we test when we do test. We take the water, we put it into a little chamber, a cuvette, put that into the spectrometer, press the button, and if there's an absorption, big absorption, or an absorption peak that appears on the scan at 270 nanometers, then we know there's EZ water. And if it's a big peak, it's got a lot of EZ water. And if it's a small peak, it's got a small amount, et cetera. So it's possible to check it. And I do think, going back to your original question, that waters that contain EZ water are going to be good for health.
Yeah.
So that was drinking a lot of water. We digressed. You asked me what can you
exactly. I put you on tangents here. So water, to maximize the amount of EZ water within us, and You mentioned then obviously drinking water, which makes sense. And then what were some other things that we can do?
Well, yeah, so green juicing. What are you doing when you take the green plants and you put them into the gadget that squeezes them to death and squeezes out the water? Well, you're squeezing out the cell water, and the cell water is full of EZ, and these plants are freshly grown, and they're not aged or something, and so you've got a good supply of EZ water inside the plants, and we actually tested for that, and that's true. And so you're taking that and drinking it. So what you're doing is drinking, I wouldn't say it's pure EZ water, but the water or the juice that you're drinking has a high content of EZ, and that should replenish what might be missing inside of your cells. And people report to me, naturopaths and alternative people, that they often will do this. Patients come in, and almost no matter what the issue is, they'll tell them to start juicing. And the reports I've gotten, these are anecdotal. The patients come back 3-4 months later, and they feel better no matter what their initial problem was. And they also have, by the way, byproduct, lost weight.
Yes.
So maybe you've had similar experience, but
absolutely.
Okay. So that's another one. And walking out in the sun. We need sunlight, and the sunlight has got all of those wavelengths, and it's natural. And here in Seattle, where the weather in the winter is often kind of grim, we have a lot of clouds. When the sun pops out, you see smiles on people's faces, and it may be a purely psychological kind of effect. Oh, bright light, but it might also be that the light is penetrating our body and building EZ water. Sunlight has some infrared. It's not the main component, but it's got plenty of it. And that brings me to another one, which is the one I kind of like the best, and that is the sauna. So you get into one of these hot. I've done it in Finland and in Russia. They're great. Russia, it's a banya instead, but it's more or less the same principle. So you get into this room, either dry or wet, that's heated, and the temperature is really high. It means you've got a lot of infrared energy coming out. And you're sitting there, and the infrared energy is penetrating through your skin. Some of the wavelengths penetrate rather deeply. And then you come out 20, 30 minutes later, after your shower or your dunk in the local river, you're feeling better. Your headache is gone. You're feeling alive again. You don't need to go hit the sack instantly. You've got renewed energy, and your headache is gone, muscle pains, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the reason is that the heat is associated with infrared energy, and your body is absorbing that infrared energy, and in turn building EZ water. And the EZ water is what all your organs need in order to function properly. So you come out functioning better than when you came in.
So
that would be...
Yes, yeah. So that kind of going along with that, you do sauna, infrared, for detoxification, and the toxins themselves, they're positive charge, correct? And then inside the cell we have negative charge. So the more EZ water we have inside of us, the more force and ability we have then to repel the positive charges, and to do detoxification. We're kind of pushing out then these toxins. Am I correct with that?
I'm not sure. Maybe that's correct. I have a slightly different vision. You say they're all positively charged, first of all, and see, most compounds are supposed to be neutral. NaCl, right, is neutral. And according to the standard views, which I will admit could well be wrong, most substances are neutral. And so the idea that they're positively charged, I think it wouldn't fit with the conventional idea. But however, I think you're right, because I'm not so sure that these substances are all neutral. In fact, we made some measurements with a voltmeter, an acid versus a base, for example, and big potential difference between the two, indicating that the acid was positive and the base was negative. And it's not supposed to be, because if you have HCl, you have H plus, Cl minus, and they should balance each other, right? And so should other compounds. And so the idea of positively charged toxins, according to conventional views, I don't see how that can be the case, but I actually think it is the case. And so let me get back to that. We found that what diminishes the amount of easy water is positive charge. We found that if you have a lot of protons, for example, no doubt positive charge, you expose lots of protons to the easy, then the easy diminishes. And so this is a possibility that the poisons that you say really do have, as you say, positive charge, and what they do is they erode the EZ. Now we have one example. We started to look at some toxins, and we looked at glyphosate. As you know, it's a weed killer.
Absolutely.
And whether it kills us too is a question. So
all the GMO that we're exposed to with the glyphosates, and
Yeah. So the people who I speak with a lot, they know that this is really serious stuff. And we decided to test to see what happens if you add glyphosate to easy water. And we did this in the laboratory, and we published it just actually a couple of weeks ago. And what glyphosate does is it diminishes the amount of easy water. It's kind of what we expect, and you're going to tell me that glyphosate is positive, and if so, I will understand that. But we found, through objective experimentation, even at extremely low concentrations, it diminishes easy water. And of course, when you get to the concentrations that are considered borderline safe, so to speak, it's a pretty substantial diminution of easy water. If easy water is so critical to function, as I believe, based on the evidence that we've obtained, then it could be that the action, the toxic action of glyphosate is based in reducing hydration, diminishing easy water. Your cell becomes hydrated, can't function, dies. And so one possibility is that many poisons act the same way. I'm always a little reluctant to expose the young people who are working in the lab to these toxins, even experimentally. So we haven't done too much of that, but we would like to. So I think you're on the right track, at least according to our experiments, about positively charged toxins.
Yeah, and because also I know you're mentioning in your book that a muscle, when it contracts, the water turns into just normal water, and then when it goes into a resting phase, and the water is easy water, it's not charged
Correct.
water. So then when we're sleeping, which is when most of our detoxification takes place, obviously the contraction of muscles are quite a bit less at that time. So I'd be fascinated to find out whether, because of that kind of resting, easy phase that takes place within all our cells and muscles at that time, if that is what's kind of promoting the detoxification, and whether the toxins that have positive charges or not, but that kind of gives the energy of moving these toxins out.
Well, in order to get any movement at all, if you have only easy water, it's a bit like soft ice. It's gel-like, and not much moves through it. Not much can enter this exclusion zone or easy. That's why we called it exclusion, because it excludes. It won't admit practically anything, and so there's not much movement that goes on. But in order for movement to occur, I mean, if you want to get the toxins, for example, out of the cell, there has to be at least some channels where there's no easy water, where there's ordinary water. And I don't know if they become more active at night, but the one point is that for things to happen, for things to move in and out of the cell or from one point to another point, if you have easy water, it won't happen, or it will happen extremely slowly. The easy water needs to convert to ordinary water. We call a phase transition between the two, in order to have any kind of motion, movement inside the cell. And as you know, you must have that for when the cell is acting, for example, when a cell is dividing or when it's secreting, or you need movements. And so in order to get the movements, you must have this conversion back to ordinary water. I don't know what happens during sleep. You, I'm sure, know better than I do what happens, but I could imagine that there must be, in order to effect this transition, or the toxins get to detoxify, somehow the movement has to occur, and
I'd like to also another point. I know we have our thoughts because I know we need to wrap up, but I'd like to just touch on circulation, on how the body, because I know that we're talking about how easy water lining themselves along the capillary walls, on the blood vessel walls, and how that then promotes some of the circulation that takes place, and also challenging a little bit how the lymphatic system moves, that it's not just muscle contractions, but it may be some other things at play as well. Because the beat of the heart is not enough to really create enough pressure for blood to go out to all the tiny little capillaries and then be pushed out into the extracellular matrix.
Well, why do you say that? I mean, I'm in agreement with you, but I'm challenging you, because I started my career doing modeling, computer modeling of the circulation, and at that time, everything seemed to work just fine. I thought, until I learned better. But why would you say that the heart is not sufficient? Is it because I said so, or because you heard somebody?
No, it is. Because you said so. Pretty much what you explained, that the capillaries, the capillaries are so tiny that the red blood cells, you pretty much need to be a single file, and they not even big enough almost for the red blood cells to pass through.
They have to. The red blood cells have to kind of squeeze through. You can watch them in some of the videos. You can see that they bend enormously to get through the capillaries, which are sometimes half the diameter of the red blood cells. So it looks like Mother Nature screwed up, but as we all know, she doesn't screw up. And but my Russian colleagues have been studying this, and they calculated if the heart were fully responsible for driving the red blood cells through these small vessels, no question about the larger vessels, but the smaller ones, they computed, they may be wrong, but they computed approximately the heart would need to develop approximately 1 million times the pressure that it develops in order to drive those red blood cells through. That's really high blood pressure. So you need some auxiliary source, and I didn't know or even think about this until I heard from this Russian guy who's been studying this. And so, you scratch your head and wonder, well, where's that coming from? So it turns out in the laboratory, we have an experiment that is kind of similar to this, that exemplifies this problem. We have a tube, an open tube like a straw, built of some hydrophilic material, very narrow, and we put it in the water, and what we see is that the flow goes through the length, along the length of the inside of the tube. It's like flow in a capillary or in a blood vessel, and it does this, what you might say, spontaneously, because there's nothing pushing it. Usually you need a pressure gradient, like the heart establishes, the ventricular or aortic blood pressure to drive the blood through. The same principle holds for most tubes. You need a pressure gradient from one end to the other to drive the fluid through. So in the laboratory, there's no gradient. The tube is sitting horizontally there, and the pressure on one side and the other side are the same. But still, it keeps flowing, and it flows indefinitely. So we studied that mechanism, and it turns out, once again, that the EZ is involved. It coats the inside of the tube, just as it coats the inside of the vessel. So, after I heard from this Russian guy, I'm scratching my head and thinking, hey, maybe the answer to this has to do with EZ. And now we've done experiments, and we know that it's correct, that it's true. And so on this basis, it looks as though for all of us, you, me, listeners, whatever, we have actually two mechanisms that drive blood in our body. One of them is the heart, and the other one is the mechanism that I just talked about that exists inside the vessel that drives the red blood or drives the blood through those vessels. So it's kind of interesting, and it has therapeutic implications too, because we know that this is driven by infrared light. It means that possibly, I don't know if this is true clinically or not, the application of infrared energy should be good for circulation, because that's what drives this auxiliary mechanism of blood flow.
Yes, I would assume that if we're deficient in infrared energy, that the heart would need to generate more pressure to achieve its goal. So, because then we have less support from the easy water. We're deficient in easy water along the capillaries.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense, and I'm in agreement with you. I'm just not sure about the magnitude, because if the Russians are right in their calculation, they may not be. They calculated roughly 1 million times. So, I mean, they can still be off by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, and it still would be a giant difference between what's available and what's needed. So if the blood pressure or ventricular pressure increased by 50% or something, it might not do a whole lot. Might do a little bit, but the need is much greater. So it might actually be that this auxiliary mechanism is, in fact, the main mechanism. I hesitate to say that because we don't have evidence for that, but it could turn out to be.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly fascinating, this easy water and the answers that it gives us a lot about physiology and how we produce energy, how circulation takes place. So I really appreciate all the research that you've done, and I truly urge all our listeners to get Dr. or Professor Pollack's book, The Fourth Phase of Water. It's a fascinating read, and it's not overwhelming. A lot of times we're a little nervous about getting a scientific book, but it's very well written, very easy to read.
Easy, thank you.
Exactly. So thank you so much, Professor Pollack, for spending time with me today and explaining some of these amazing scientific conclusions that you've come to.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for your astute questions.
Well, thank you.
Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Take care.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye now. So that is all for today. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt with HealthMade Radio. Remember to connect with us at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it.